Very interesting discussion. Thanks to all those who contributed. I won't try to respond to all the points, but just to a few. On the centrality of Israel to imperial projects in the Middle East, of course, I agree with that, but it is important to note that the United States and its allies have never only relied on Israel. They critically relied on the Shah's regime in Iran before it was overthrown, and they critically relied on Saudi Arabia and still do. The biggest market for British arms exporters is not Israel, although they sell them enough. It's to Saudi Arabia. So it's important to understand that the imperial structure of the Middle East is involved centrally with Israel, but not only centrally with Israel, with other powers as well. I agree with the colleague who spoke, I think, from Solidarity. I disagreed with him about his support for Assad, the second speaker, but a number of the other points I think are very, very important that he made. That firstly, that US imperialism is still the most powerful imperialism in the world, but it has been weakened, it has been in part paralysed in some of its operations by the defeat of its project for Iraq. This is not the first time. There was, before the Iraq syndrome, the Vietnam syndrome. It doesn't mean that it can't recover. It doesn't mean that it can't mount renewed offensives in the future, even though this time round it is faced by economic challenges that it wasn't at the time of the Vietnam syndrome. I agree with the point about the economic underpinning. I wouldn't limit it to the banks. The whole nature of the capitalist system is the underpinning of the imperial system, and you can't reduce the whole nature of the capitalist system simply to the banks. I agree with that point, and it's precisely for that reason that the Stop the War coalition became one of the sponsors of the People's Assembly. Why? Just in case you've missed it, we have built an anti-war bloc on the anti-austerity demonstration on the 20th. I think that will be the biggest demonstration since some of the Iraq demonstrations, and we've done that precisely because we want to make the link between austerity and war in this country, between the imperial system and the capitalist economic system in this country, and by doing that, we will not only make it, important though that is to make that link in a meeting with hundreds in it, we will make it on a demonstration which will have hundreds of thousands on it, and we will report it to millions of people, and that's the correct place for a mass movement to make its points. On the question of the European Union, I don't think that Stop the War will be centrally involved in that referendum, but I agree with the points that are made. It's important to understand that the EU is an imperial project and is linked, as the speaker said, directly now, not for the old member states, but for new member states acceding to the Union. It is a requirement that they are part of the European Union. There will be more than one opinion expressed on this issue by the left in the course of it, but I personally am in that part of the movement which says that the European Union is a hostile institution to working people. Look what it's doing to the Greek government. And by the way, this won't be just about immigration. They tell you if you're in favour of immigration, you must be on the pro-European side. No, Fortress Europe is tipping people into the Mediterranean because it is an anti-immigrant organisation. What immigration inside the EU is about white immigration. And it's about kicking everybody else out of the EU and out of Fortress Europe. So those are my views on that matter and its connection to it. What I finally say about many of these debates, and I say this to our critics who say that we're insufficiently supportive of President Assad. No, I'm not a supporter of President Assad. It is not a requirement of being against your own government's policy in the Middle East that you support of governments or movements in other parts of the world. And we've been repeatedly accused of this. We are told that if you're against British government policy, you must be, well, let's listen. You must be a supporter of the Taliban. You must be a supporter of Saddam Hussein. You must be a supporter of President Putin. You must be a supporter of Colonel Gaddafi. You must be a supporter of President Assad. No, that is not a requirement. Our requirement is that when we live in the heart of the imperial architecture of the world, our business is to get on the back of our government and stop them getting on the back of the peoples of the Middle East or any other part of the globe. That's our primary responsibility. And that's the thing that we have to agree on. That's the only thing that we have to agree on. And whether or not we have one view or another view about the future of Syria or Libya or Afghanistan or any other part of the globe, we should also make this point. That is the business of Syrians, of Libyans, of Afghans. Our business is to make sure that they can make their choices without the imperial powers on their back.
Thanks. Very briefly, but I think it's impressive that we managed to get 12 questions in on what is probably the biggest seminar we've got today. Number of issues. Actually, the last one on the European Union is a very interesting one, because the European Union was established as a project partly designed by the USA in Congress for Cultural Freedom in Amsterdam in 1949, developed from that into the common market, developed from that into the European Union. And many people on the left have very mixed feelings about it. There are elements of European law, working time directive and social law issues that are quite impressive. There are economic issues that post-Maastricht, Margaret Thatcher's involvement in that and later John Major, is to create a market Europe rather than workers' Europe and continue to diminish workers' rights and free movement across Europe. And what Farage and Cameron basically want is a market Europe where big business is very heavily protected, and that is really what TTIP is all about. But you're absolutely right to bring in the whole foreign policy aspect of it as well, because, as I said in my own contribution, the Lisbon Treaty was absolutely fundamental to linking new EU members to NATO and linking the EU's foreign policy to NATO, and with it the role that the European Union increasingly plays in international affairs, particularly in Africa, on behalf of that kind of military bloc. So yes, I do think we'll need to ensure that we make a voice about the connection of NATO and the connection of military expenditure to Europe in the referendum, whenever that comes, and whatever terms that referendum is about. But I think we also, I'm sure we won't, need to be very cautious about having any innocent or otherwise links with the large numbers of extremely racist groups that are going to use the whole referendum as an attack on migration of any sort, particularly migration from non-Europeans into the European Union. And John is quite right that the tragedy of the Mediterranean is a tragedy of the making of xenophobia and of the making of those that have sought to create this Fortress Europe idea. Why are they more interested in repelling people than saving lives, until eventually it was a media campaign exposing the numbers that have died there. Many other issues were raised, but I think the fundamental one is really the attempt of the neocons at the moment, led by Blair and others, to completely rewrite history. They're saying that they were right to go into Iraq because the alternative would have been to leave Saddam Hussein there, as though all of us in this room were actually in the Saddam Hussein fan club. Personally, I never was, but I do recall in the 1980s being a very lonely voice in the British Parliament questioning why we were selling so many arms to Iraq that were being used to oppress the Iraqi people by the Saddam Hussein regime. I was told I was undermining Britain's economic interests in this particular endeavour. There's always a British economic interest in selling arms to people, whoever they happen to be, providing they buy the arms. We see the consequences of that all over the Middle East at the present time. And so we have to challenge that rewriting of history. Those million people that marched in London and came to Hyde Park, maybe more, and all over the world, in that worldwide demonstration, some will finish, promise, yes, were they all wrong? Were they all totally misguided? Were they all fools? Were they all knaves? No, they were people that didn't want the world
plunged into war over Iraq. And I do remember Bruce Kent's prescient words at the launching meeting of the Stop the War Coalition, when he said, "This war will beget war after war after war." Where was he wrong? Where was he wrong? We have built up a war machine, funded in part by oil interests, in part by Western interests, which ensures perpetual war. Who benefits from those wars? Those that want cheap oil, those that want natural resources, those that want to sell arms, and the massive security industry that is effectively part of the privatising of war, where effectively people just go and do whatever a country tells them to do. So we have the war fought by mercenaries in the pay of security companies in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in so many other places. So we have to understand why I think those of us that marched against the war in 2003 were right, and how we do not need any more voices from Tony Blair or George Bush, or I don't wish to discredit all of the future descendants of the Bush Empire, but the next one that's on offer to the USA doesn't seem to me to be fundamentally any different from the last two that were on offer. Maybe if we jump a few generations, there'll be a good Bush somewhere. We look forward to that day. But our purpose is to understand that modern imperialism isn't necessarily flags on territory, as it was in the 19th and early 20th century. It's big business on territory, exploiting things, and it's using cultural imperialism and xenophobia in order to ensure that is the way they achieve that power. It's up to us to present an alternative. Thank you.
Is really seen by the Israeli government as the #1 threat, at least in the United States, and in fact the very rich magnate Sheldon Adelson, who is buying many of the elections in the United States, this weekend is having a big confab in Las Vegas to try to counter BDS. And one of the ways they do this is to say that anybody involved in BDS is anti-Semitic, which is why it is so important for the Jewish community to be very strong on this issue. And as a member of the Jewish community, I'm very excited that there is a growing movement like Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States that is very strong and very forceful on this issue. And the last thing I'll say is that since the name of Irving Kristol, the neocon, was invoked, that his definition of neocon was a liberal that was mugged by reality. I think our job is to mug the neocons and let them see reality.
So we come to the end of the session now. Thank you, John, Jeremy, and Medea. It's been a fantastic session. Just to